Chapter 2. The Letter is Dead. It is a strange thing for a teacher to say. By the 6th week of 6th grade, Miss Hussey was still not a disappointment. She had announced on the first day of school that she had no idea what they were going to work on that year, or how. "It all depends on what we get interested in, or what gets interested in us," she had added as if it was obvious. Calder Philby was all ears. He had never heard a teacher admit that she didn't know what she was doing. Even better, she was excited about it. Miss Hussey's class was in the middle school building at the University School, in the neighborhood known as Hyde Park. The school sat on the edge of the University of Chicago campus. John Dewey, an unusual professor, had started it centuries earlier as an experiment. Dewey believed in working on, relevant projects in order to learn how to think. Calder had always liked the man's appropriate name. Not all teachers at the U, as it was called, still agreed with Dewey's ideas, but Miss Hussey obviously did. They began the year by arguing about whether writing was the most accurate way to communicate. Petra Ansley, who loved to write, said it was. Kids like Calder, who hated it, said it wasn't. What about numbers? What about pictures? What about plain old... Miss Hussey had told them to investigate. They took piles of books out of the library. They found about cave art in France, about papyrus scrolls in Egypt, about Mayan petroglyphs in Mexico, and about stone tablets from the Middle East. They tried things. They made stamps out of raw potatoes, covered the walls with symbols. They invented a sign language for hands and feet. They communicated for one whole day using nothing but drawings. Now it was almost mid-October. Would they ever study regular subjects like the other classes did? Calder didn't care. What they were doing was real exploration, real thinking, not just finding out about what a bunch of dead famous grown-ups believed. Miss Hussey was cool. D-E-A-D. She'd written it on the board. They were talking about letters that morning because Calder had groaned about having to write a thank you note and said it was always a waste of time. No one cared about what you put in a letter. Then Miss Hussey asked if anyone in class had ever received a truly extraordinary letter. No, it had. Miss Hussey looked very interested. They had ended up with a strange assignment. "Let's see what we can find," Miss Hussey began. "Ask an adult to tell you about a letter they will never forget. I'm talking about a piece of mail that changed their life. How old were they when they got it? Where they were when they opened it? And do they still have it?" Petra, like Calder, was fascinated by their new teacher. She loved Miss Hussey's questions and her long ponytail, and the 3 rings on each ear. One earring had a small pearl dangling from a moon, another a high-heeled shoe the size of a grain of rice, and another tiny key. Petra loved how Miss Hussey listened carefully to the kids' ideas and didn't care about right or wrong answers. She was honest and unpredictable. She was close to perfect. Miss Hussey suddenly clapped her hands, making Petra jump, setting that little pearl earring into orbit. "I know. Once you find a letter that changed your life, sit down and write me a letter. Write me a letter that I won't be able to forget." Calder pulled a pentomino piece out of his pocket. It was an L. He grinned. L for letter. This letter was definitely not dead. L was one of the most simplest pentomino shapes to use. Most letters, the kind you mailed, were rectangles. He realized, just like an accurately put-together pentomino solution. L is also the 12th letter in the alphabet, and one of the 12 pentominos. Today, the 12th day of October, Calder's grandmother had once told him that he breathed patterns, but other people breathed air. Calder sighed. If only thoughts didn't have to be broken down into words. Too much talking was hard to listen to, and writing for him was brutal. So much got left behind. Miss Hussey ended the class by saying, "Got it? First find, then do. Who knows where this will take us?" Calder and Petra lived on Harper Avenue, a narrow street next to the train line. Their houses were 3 blocks away from the U, and 3 houses away from each other. They often passed on the street, but they had never been friends. Families came from all over to study or teach at the University of Chicago, and many of them lived in this part of Hyde Park. Since most parents worked, young kids traveled on their own around the campus and to and from school. On the afternoon of October 12th, Petra walked home from school with Calder a half a block ahead. She watched him fish around for his keys and open his front door. She knew his pockets were filled with puzzle pieces, and sometimes muttered things, and always looked like he had just woken up. He was kind of weird. Scuffing through the first fall leaves, Petra drifted into a game she often played with herself. Ask a question that doesn't have an answer. Why was yellow so cheerful, she wondered, and why was it always a surprise, even when it came in an ordinary shape like a lemon or an egg yolk? Picking up a yellow leaf, she held it in front of her face. Maybe she would write Miss Hussey about this. She'd ask her if she agreed that humans needed questions more than they needed answers. Calder, at that moment, looked out of his front window to see Petra walking by holding a leaf several inches from her nose. He knew she was kind of weird, but she was exceptionally weird. She was always by herself at school and didn't seem to care. She was quiet when other kids were loud. Plus, she had a fierce triangle of hair that made her look like one of those Egyptian queens. Calder wondered if he was becoming just as much of an oddball. No one had asked him what he was doing after class that day. No one had told him to wait. He had taken his buddy Tommy's presence for granted, but not now. Tommy Segovia had lived across the street from Calder until the past August. They had been great friends since second grade, when Tommy poured chocolate milk on Calder's bare legs and asked him how it felt. A teacher rushed over, and Calder had explained that it was just an experiment and that it felt just perfect. That was the first of many collaborations. He and Tommy had decided back in July that they were not going to be mediocre kids. They swore that they were going to do something important with their lives, solve a great mystery, or maybe rescue someone, or be so smart that they'd skip grades. That was the same day that Calder had received his first set of pentominoes. A cousin in London had sent them on his 12th birthday present, even though Calder's birthday wasn't until the end of the year. The pentominoes were yellow plastic and clacked against the kitchen table in a satisfying, decisive way. Determined, Calder moved the shapes into one combination after another, flipping and turning them. The biggest rectangle he had put together so far was 6 pieces. A breeze was coming in the back door, and some mourning doves had just nested on the back porch were cooing, making a slippery, blurbering sound that Calder always associated with the summer. Every detail of that morning with Tommy was strangely clear. At once, Calder had known what to do. The Y had to slide into the U, which had to fit next to the P, and he even remembered the sequence of the letters. W, U, P. He had gotten his first 12-piecer, and gotten it so fast. When he looked up afterward, he saw the pentomino shapes echoed in the kitchen. The hinges and the cabinets were L's, the water faucets were X's, and the burners in the stove stood up on neat N legs. Maybe the entire world could be communicated in some kind of pentomino code, like the kind of Morse code. He knew at that moment that he would be a great problem solver, or so he told Tommy, who punched him in the arm and told him he had a swell head. "Yep," he said with a grin. Calder's head didn't feel too swelled these days. He looked at the clock. He was already late. When Tommy moved away, Calder had taken over his job at Powell's Used Books. Calder helped out one afternoon a week, delivering books in the neighborhood and unloading boxes. With Tommy gone, it was something to do. Calder gulped a glass of chocolate milk and stuffed a cookie into each cheek and set off at a run. Powell's was one of Petra's favorite places. It was peaceful, and you never knew what you might find. It looked more like a warehouse than a store. Books were piled everywhere, and the room was jumbled together in a mismatched way. Although Petra had been inside many times, it always felt like a labyrinth. One dimly lit area led to the next, and suddenly you were back where you started without knowing how you got there. No one asked if you needed help. No one frowned if you read and didn't buy. Petra's mom had sent her to get milk and bread at the grocery store around the corner. Powell's was on the way. Petra had just settled herself on a footstool with a copy of Kidnapped when she saw a long ponytail whip by. Miss Husey? Petra stood up carefully. She peeked around the corner, ready to pretend not to look surprised. There was no one in sight. Petra looked across a row of cookbooks. She tiptoed carefully through the next room, past English, history, psychology, and pets. She only wanted to see what Miss Husey was reading. Darn, the next person she saw was Calder. He was bending over a box of books, a piece of paper in his hands. Don't turn around. Don't you dare turn around, Petra thought. She didn't want anyone from class seeing her spying. She tiptoed around the next corner. Miss Husey was crouched by the art books. Petra could see what she was looking at, but she noticed several paperbacks next to her on the floor. Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler. Miss Husey moved suddenly, and Petra jumped backwards. To her surprise, Calder was right behind her. Had obviously seen what she was doing. Petra cupped her hand quickly around to cover his mouth and stopped before she touched him. They looked equally shocked. Calder, recovering first, peered around the corner. He ducked back in a flash. She's coming! It felt too late to do anything but hide, so they hurried out of the history and into fiction. Miss Husey was at the front desk now. She plopped down her books and began talking to Mr. Watch. The man had red suspenders, who was usually at the cash register. They were laughing. Did they know each other? Can you see what she has? Petra whispered. Calder walked quickly behind the teacher, his eyes on the counter. Miss Husey never turned her head. Murder and a big art book. Never something, he muttered to Petra, who he had returned to. Miss Husey left the store with her purchases. A moment later, Petra ducked outside, empty-handed, her cheeks burning. She was furious with herself. Powell's had always been her private hideaway, her refuge. Now she'd spoken to Calder there. She was practically attacked by him, and he'd seen her spying on Miss Husey. What had she started?